What do you seek of me?
I seek salvation. This disease has been taunting me for years. Please free me from it.
Here, take this. Burn it and put its ashes into water, then drink it.
I'll be saved from misery.
Yes.
Hey, police, stop right there.
Here's what happened. This is an example of the practice of consulting shamans, witch doctors, or traditional healer. Imagine this. You are seriously ill. Modern medicine doesn't seem to work. Someone claims that they can heal you not through science, but through unseen forces, spirits, rituals, or ancient knowledge. Now, would you believe them? And more importantly, should you? Nowadays, while this practice is not normally seen in our daily lives, it is still a source of spiritual life in certain societies across the world, such as the Amazon Basin, Sub-Saharan Africa, and certain parts of Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, for example, bomos have long been part of cultural life, offering spiritual healing and guidance. To an outsider, these rituals might be seen as a simple form of tradition, shaped by belief, psychology, and culture, and conditioned by shared faith, while to some, they might even seem outrageous. But to those who practice them, these are real spiritual truths that show powerful connections to a world beyond that what we can see. So, this raises an important question. Are these practices morally acceptable, or are they just culturally influenced beliefs that may not be universally right or wrong? Throughout this show, we are going to explore how these practices relate to the idea of moral relativism. We will also examine how different religions view these practices. Do they support them, tolerate them, or reject them? In addition, we will also analyze this issue through major philosophical theories. Now then, we have experts here that will bring us closer to the topic. Let's welcome Miss Yi Min Yi and Miss Ernie.
Thanks for inviting me for this interview. Hello, I'm Gong Min Hee, who reaches the real spiritual truth and the belief of traditional. Before we start, I would like to start with questions. First, what is the traditional healing practice? Does someone really connect to the spiritual, or those practices triggered by belief and culture? All of this will lead to an important question. Is traditional healing practice based on their real spiritual truth, or they are simply traditional shaped by belief? In this presentation, I will compare these two perspectives by looking at philosophy, real-life example, and scientific explanations before discussing the challenges. And for me and conclusion, let's start from the traditional healing practice. Practice such as shaman, witch doctor, and spiritual healers have existed for 1,000 years across different cultures. However, there are still debate about whether those practices reflect a real unseen realities or whether they are influenced by human belief and perceptions. Firstly, from the perspective of real spiritual truth, many people believe that traditional healers are able to access unseen spiritual force. In many indigenous cultures, healing is not only physical, but involves spiritual, social, and natural elements. For example, Amazonian shamans use rituals such as ayahuasca to communicate with the spirit world and restore balance. This idea is supported by philosopher Plato, who believed that reality is not limited to the physical world, but also include a non-physical realm of truth. This suggests that spiritual healing may access something real beyond what science can currently measure. In addition, the concept of altered state of consciousness shows how shamans enter different mental states through drumming, fasting, and plant medicines. Supporters argue that those are not just hallucinations, but alternative way of experiencing reality. Therefore, from this perspective, traditional healing may effect genuine spiritual truth. On the other hand, from a scientific and perspective, those practices can be seen as shaped by belief and culture. One key explanation is the placebo effect, where belief in a treatment can lead to the real physical improvement. For example, when a patient believes in a healer's power, their brain may release chemicals such as endorphins and dopamine, which can improve their conditions. A real example is a Navajo healing which focusing on restoring hoso, meaning the balance and harmony. This practice is spiritual. It also can be explanation scientifically, as it reduces stress and improves emotional support. In addition, those practices strengthen community cohesion, bringing people together to create a shared sense of identity, which are the traditions similar to the celebrations like Christmas or Ramadan can help to build the trust and reinforce belief in the healing practice. This suggests that the effectiveness of the traditional healing may be influenced more by the psychology and the social factors than the spiritual reality. However, there are also important challenges. Firstly, there are lack of scientific evidence and rely on the traditional healing can be shaky. For example, during the Ebola virus disease outbreak in West Africa, around 70% to 80% of the populations in the same area depend on the traditional medicines. Studies show that some traditional and spiritual healers falsely claimed that they could cure Ebola and even promote the methods such as warm salt water bath and salted drinks as preventions. However, those methods are not scientifically proven, and patients delay the proper medical treatment. At the same time, close contact during the practice increase exposure and infects beauty fluids, which cause the disease to spread further, even infecting the healer themselves. This example shows that traditional healing can be more dangerous when it replaces scientific medical care. Secondly, some practices may cause psychological harm, especially when the people are told they are coerced or possessed, which can increase the fear and anxiety. This also directs over exploitations where fake healers take advantage of vulnerable individuals of money or power. In conclusion, traditional healing practice cannot be seen as purely true or purely false. There exists between spiritual belief, psychological effects, and cultural meanings. While there is no clear scientific proof that those practices exist a real spiritual force, they can still prove a real benefits, such as the emotional support and the community connections. However, they can be harmful when they replace modern medical or promote fear. Therefore, a balanced view is needed, one that respects the cultural traditions while also recognizing the importance of science and ethics. Ultimately, the key question is not just whether those practices are real, but what type of truth they represent. So, now I will end my part now. Let's move on to Miss Ernie, who reaches the moral relativism and the cross-cultural applicability.
Hi, I'm Nirani, and I will be sharing on moral relativism and cross-cultural applicability. So, moral relativism holds that moral judgments are true or false only relative to the particular standpoint, such as cultural tradition, social norms, and historical period. And there's no single standpoint is universally privileged. This position can be summarized in 3 points. Cultural dependency. Moral standard emerge from specific culture, and there is no universal morality that applies across cultures. Recognizing of diversity. Different cultures have real and often incommensurable moral practice. Non-judgment. We should not judge other cultures' moral practice by the standard of our own. So when applied to the traditional healings, this means that this practice, which outsiders might dismiss as superstition, should instead be understood within their own cultural logic. Traditional healings support the moral division in 3 key ways. First, cultural embeddedness. Traditional healings is deeply embedded in the worldview and social structure of a culture. It means that it is inseparable from its cultural context. Therefore, it cannot be judged by external moral standard. Second, internal logical consistency. Within its own cultural framework, traditional healing is rational and coherent. If we accept the cultural premises, such as the existence of a spiritual world, then the practices make sense internally. Through the cultural dependency of moral judgment, the same practice may be seen as accepted in one culture and superstition in another, and this shows that there is no universal standard for moral judgment across the culture. However, moral relativism faces serious challenge when traditional practice cause verifiable harm and violate fundamental human rights. These challenges appear in 3 forms. First, cross-cultural moral intuition. Some practice, such as causing physical harm and vulnerable individuals, provoke moral revulsion across the different cultures. This suggests that there may be basic moral bottom lines and that trusting cultural differences. Second, diversity within culture. Cultures are not monolithic. There are often multiple viewpoints and internal debates about the traditional practice. Moral relativism cannot tell us which internal voice should be prioritized. Third, verifiable harm. When traditional healing results in physical injury, death, delay of effective treatment, these harms are measurable across cultures. In such case, cross-cultural moral judgment is justified, not to dismiss all traditional practice, but to engage in careful evaluation. So, how do we determine whether the traditional healing practice can be applied across culture? There's 2 perspectives are worth considering. From the cultural particular perspective, some traditional healing practices are deeply tied into specific worldviews. If transplanted into a different cultural context, they may be lose meaning or even cause unintended harm. The authority of traditional healers, for example, is often rooted in their local community. So from the cross-cultural values perspective, certain elements of traditional healing have universal value. These include the holistic view of health, therapies validated by modern pharmacology, the psychotherapeutic value of ritual, and the relationship-centered model of care. As the WHO Director General noted, traditional medicine should be studied with specific rigor while respecting its holistic, natural, and local knowledge. So in conclusion, moral relativism reminds us to respect cultural difference, but when harm and human rights at stake, cross-cultural moral judgment is not only justified, it is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you for such meaningful sharing. Now that we have a basic insight on the topic, let's ask what they think of it.
Islam generally rejects practices involving shamans or witch doctor. These practices are often associated with sorcery, church, and black magic, both of which are viewed negatively in Islamic teachings. The Holy Quran often portrays magic negatively. It is also commonly believed by the Muslim that sorcery causes harm from different aspects. Moreover, Islam emphasizes Tawhid as its core principle and prohibits engaging in magic, fortune telling, or seeking supernatural help outside of God. Consulting shamans may be regarded as shirk, which is considered as a serious sin, as the act itself shows a clear sign of reliance on the unseen or treatment of illnesses through a medium, others that they are God. Traditional Christianity largely opposes these practices as well, as clearly written in the Bible. No one among you is to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spell, consult a medium of a spiritist, or inquire of the dead. Again, as spoken, he took our weaknesses and carried our diseases. Christians have a strong belief that God can help all disease and sickness. Many Christians therefore believe that relying on shamans or witch doctor contradicts find in God authority and power to help. As a result, such practices are generally not accepted within Christianity. On the other hand, Buddhists take a more neutral stand depending on the culture and tradition. Unlike Islam and Christianity, Buddhists denies the existence of the Greek god. Let's say, traditional Buddhism is rich with supernatural belief in God, spirit, demons, tiny, heavenly, and heavenly realms. But while it was believed that they exist, they are not to be relied upon. core Buddhist teaching focus more on personal enrichment and do not emphasize supernatural intervention. In some culture, traditional healing practices coexist with Buddhist belief. Local tradition often blend Buddhist with spiritual practice and healing research, especially in South Asia and Tibet. Hindus is generally more receptive of these practices. Hindu's teaching include a wide range of beliefs, some of which involve spiritual healer, ritual, and communication with divine or spiritual force. Hindu tradition includes ritual healers, mantras, and spiritual intermediaries. Hindu traditional include ritual healings, mantras, and spiritual intermediaries. Traditional healers are integrated into religious and cultural life, making some practice acceptable within many Hindu contexts.
Wow, looks like not everyone holds the same opinion. Now, let's move on to our last expert, Miss Xingyan. Care to enlighten us, Miss Xingyan?
Now we will look at the morality of traditional healing through four philosophical theories. The four theories are utilitarianism, deontology, ritual ethics, and ethical egoism. Starting with utilitarianism, we focus on outcomes. Does traditional medicine produce the greatest good for the greatest number? In places like Ethiopia and sub-Saharan Africa, where over 80% of the population relies on these practices, the answer is often yes. It is affordable, culturally accessible, and provides essential mental health support through community rituals. However, from a utilitarian perspective, the morality is lost if the practice lacks standardization. If unregulated remedies cause more harm than relief, the cost to public health outweighs the benefits, making it ethically problematic. Moving from outcomes to duties, we look at deontology. Here, the result doesn't matter as much as the moral obligation of a healer. To be ethical under deontology, a healer must follow universal rules like honesty and respect for autonomy. This is where traditional healing often faces the biggest challenge, the duty of disclosure. If a healer keeps ingredients secret or make false promises to protect their trade, they are failing to respect the patient's right to make an informed choice. For traditional medicine to be deontologically sound, healer must prioritize transparency and informed consent over cultural secrecy. Next, we consider ritual ethics, which focuses on the character of the healer rather than just the groups. Is the practitioner a good person? Traditional healers are often highly valued because they practice the ritual of compassion, treating the whole person, including their spiritual and social needs, which is something modern medicine sometimes overlooks. However, we see a loss of ritual when the practice becomes overly commercialized. When a healer prioritizes financial gain by taking advantage of vulnerable patients, such as those seeking cures for chronic illnesses, they lose their moral standing because their intent is no longer the patient's flourishing. Finally, we look at ethical egoism, which views morality through the lens of the patient's own self-interest. From this perspective, choosing traditional healing is rational and moral choice if it benefits the individual. For many patients in places like Burma and Uganda, traditional medicine is faster, cheaper, and more cultural comforting than the hospital. If a patient feels safer and more in control of their own body by choosing a natural remedy, ethical egoism argues that they are making the most moral choice for their own well-being. And by looking through these four lenses, we see that traditional healing isn't just about medicine. It's a complex balance of results, duties, character, and personal choice.
As we have seen, the practice of consulting shamans, bomos, and traditional healers exists across many cultures, each shaped by their own history, beliefs, and spiritual understanding of the world. For some, these practices represent real spiritual truths, ways of connecting unseen forces and finding healing beyond modern science. For others, they are cultural traditions, influenced by belief, psychology, and social trust rather than objective reality. It brings us back to the idea of moral relativism. On one hand, these practices support moral relativism in three aspects, which are cultural embeddedness, internal logical consistency, and the cultural dependence of moral judgment. However, these practices also challenge moral relativism at the same time. When issues such as harm, deception, or exploitation arise, such as delaying medical treatment or taking advantage of vulnerable individuals, many would argue that these actions are wrong regardless of cultural context. This suggests that some moral standards may go beyond culture. Religious perspectives further highlight this complexity. Islam and Christianity generally discourage or reject such practices, especially when they involve supernatural claims outside of divine authority. In contrast, Buddhism and Hinduism tend to be more flexible, often allowing or integrating certain traditional or spiritual healing practices within their belief systems. From a philosophical perspective, different theories offer different conclusions. Utilitarianism focuses on outcomes, whether these practices reduce suffering or cause harm. Deontology emphasizes their compliance with universal duties such as honesty, confidentiality, and respect for patient autonomy. Virtue ethics examines the character and intentions of the healer, whereas egoism helps explain why individuals may choose to believe in or practice these traditions. Together, these perspectives show that the issue is not simply black and white, which means it is not a question that can be decided simply as right or wrong. So, are these practices acceptable for everyone? The answer is not absolute. They may be acceptable within certain cultural and religious contexts where they provide meaning, comfort, and identity. However, they should also be carefully evaluated, especially when they affect health, safety, and ethical responsibility. In a diverse world, it is not only important to respect cultural practices, but it is also critical to think critically about their impact. Ultimately, this reminds us that morality is shaped by culture, but is also guided by deeper questions about truth, harm, and human well-being. Well then, it's a pity to stop here, but all good things must come to an end. That's our show for today. Thanks to everyone who participated, and a huge special thanks to all our viewers. See you next time.